Tonight, you'll be dozing off from the backseat of your parents' car, softly cradled by the gentle hum of the engine as it travels homeward late at night along a country highway. Imagine you are sitting in the back seat with your head nestled into a cozy pillow propped against the window. You are gazing out at the moonlit countryside, and on your face is a soft and secret smile. It's late Friday night, after playing in the pep band at your brother's basketball game far from home. Your kid sister has nodded off already. She's laying across the wide seat with her head resting softly in your lap. You are tired too after a long week of high school and homework, but you're also full of wonder, and that smile on your face is perfectly concealed in the shadows, only illuminated sporadically by the flickering flashes of light cast from the headlights of oncoming cars. You rest your forehead against the cool glass of the window. Every now and then, a distant farmhouse light appears, towering like a lighthouse in the dark, casting bright beams across the endless, waterless ocean of a prairie. Now, slowly we'll begin to relax. First, with eyes closed, just become aware of your breathing, feeling your chest gently rise and fall again. Next, we'll try taking a few deeper breaths, filling our lungs with air, holding it, and then gently exhaling and letting it all go. Ready? Inhale deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. One more time. Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. And try thinking to yourself, as I sit here in the back seat, I can feel gravity's pull tugging me gently back towards Earth. With every exhale, I can feel the weight of the day slipping away. I can feel my feet, my ankles, calves, knees, and my legs, each part of me relaxing deeper and becoming heavier and more relaxed. Up in the front seat, your parents recap and relive the big game. They talk of jump shots and fouls, rebounds and timeouts. You close your eyes, but when you picture the crowded gymnasium, you remember something much sweeter than basketball. Your mind drifts back, but now the memory of the night is soothing and hypnotic, somehow quieter, as if it all played out in slow motion. Sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floor, cheers blasting out from spirit sections choreographed by cheerleaders and mascots. The aroma of popcorn and hot dogs snaking its way from concessions all the way through the hot air, above the teams and players and referees, and then high into the packed stands where you and the band played and cheered and sang. You quietly reflect on how unexpected your first love appeared in your young life. It feels as if the universe brought it to you slowly, and yet, in the end, also unexpectedly in a flash. Now let's try taking a few more deep breaths. Ready? Breathe in deeply. Hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. Try continuing on your own, and while doing this, try thinking to yourself, as I sit here, my whole body feels heavy and relaxed. With every exhale, I can feel gravity pulling me back towards Earth gently. I can feel my head, my shoulders, my neck becoming relaxed and at ease. And my legs are heavy and at peace with gravity's pull. Now my whole body, my legs and feet, my arms and hands, my torso, my head and neck and shoulders, my whole body is completely at peace, relaxed, and at ease. For weeks and weeks at band practice and at games, you had played right there next to each other, bumping elbows, close enough to catch quick flashes of fragrances, close enough for smiles, quick glances, silly and innocent flirtations without considering really when and where or if you might actually ever kiss. And then, unexpectedly, tonight, it just happened. while the whole gymnasium was on its feet, the whole world preoccupied with some monumental moment of a basketball game. It just happened right there in the minuscule universe between the two of you. When you think about it now, falling in love was a lot like those farmhouse lights out there in the darkness. Everything approached so slowly at first, off in the distance, hardly moving at all. And then, love gained momentum and approached you carefully and timidly, getting closer and closer, and before you knew it, before you both knew it, true love had rushed up on you in a heartbeat, irresistible and suddenly undeniable. You smile now, thinking how you had always imagined your first kiss would happen somewhere private and hidden, and yet, in the end, yours was out in the open and in front of hundreds of people who never even saw it. As your parents dial in the AM radio, you finally close your eyes and lean back.
The Old Manse. From Mosses from an Old Manse by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The author makes the reader acquainted with his abode. Between two tall gate posts of rough-hewn stone, the gate itself having fallen from its hinges at some unknown epoch, we beheld the gray front of the old parsonage, terminating the vista of an avenue of black ash trees. It was now 12 months since the funeral procession of the venerable clergyman, its last inhabitant, had turned from that gateway towards the village burying ground. The wheel track leading to the door, as well as the whole breadth of the avenue, was almost overgrown with grass, affording dainty mouthfuls to 2 or 3 vagrant cows and an old white horse who had his own living to pick up along the roadside. The glimmering shadows that lay half asleep between the door of the house and the public highway were a kind of spiritual medium, seen through which the edifice had not quite the aspect of belonging to the material world. Certainly it had little in common with those ordinary abodes which stand so imminent upon the road that every passerby can thrust his head, as it were, into the domestic circle. From these quiet windows, the figures of passing travelers looked too remote and dim to disturb the sense of privacy. In its near retirement and accessible seclusion, it was the very spot for the residence of a clergyman, a man not estranged from human life, yet enveloped in the midst of it with a veil woven of intermingled gloom and brightness. It was worthy to have been one of the time-honored parsonages of England, in which, through many generations, a succession of holy occupants pass from youth to age, and bequeath each an inheritance of sanctity to pervade the house and hover over it as with an atmosphere. Nor, in truth, had the Old Manse ever been profaned by a lay occupant until that memorable summer afternoon when I entered it as my home. A priest had built it. A priest had succeeded to it. Other priestly men from time to time had dwelt in it, and children born in its chambers had grown up to assume the priestly character. It was awful to reflect how many sermons must have been written there. The latest inhabitant alone, he by whose translation to paradise the dwelling was left vacant, had penned nearly 3,000 discourses, besides the better, if not the greater number, that gushed living from his lips. How often, no doubt, had he paced to and fro along the avenue, attuning his meditations to the sighs and gentle murmurs and deep and solemn peals of the wind among the lofty tops of the trees. In that variety of natural utterances he could find something accordant with every passage of his sermon, were it of tenderness or reverential fear. The boughs over my head seemed shadowy with solemn thoughts, as well as with rustling leaves. I took shame to myself for having been so long a writer of idle stories, and ventured to hope that wisdom would descend upon me with the falling leaves of the avenue, and that I should light upon an intellectual treasure in the Old Manse, well worth those hoards of long-hidden gold which people seek for in moss-grown houses. Profound treatises of morality, a layman's unprofessional and therefore unprejudiced views of religion. Histories, such as Bancroft might have written had he taken up his abode here, as he once purposed, bright with picture, gleaming over a depth of philosophic thought. These were the works that might fitly have flowed from such a retirement. In the humblest event, I resolved at least to achieve a novel that should evolve some deep lesson and should possess physical substance enough to stand alone. In furtherance of my design, and as if to leave me no pretext for not fulfilling it, there was in the rear of the house the most delightful little nook of a study that ever afforded its snug seclusion to a scholar. It was here that Emerson wrote Nature, for he was then an inhabitant of the manse, and used to watch the Assyrian dawn and Paphian sunset and moonrise from the summit of our eastern hill. When I first saw the room, its walls were blackened with the smoke of unnumbered years, and made still blacker by the grim prints of Puritan ministers that hung around. These worthies looked strangely like bad angels, or at least like men who had wrestled so continually and so sternly with the devil that somewhat of his sooty fierceness had been imparted to their own visages. They had all vanished now. A cheerful coat of paint and golden-tinted paper hangings lighted up the small apartment, while the shadow of a willow tree that swept against the overhanging eaves attempered the cheery western sunshine. In place of the grim prince, there was the sweet and lovely head of one of Raphael's Madonnas, and two pleasant little pictures of the Lake of Como. The only other decorations were a purple vase of flowers, always fresh, and a bronze one containing graceful ferns. My books, few and by no means choice, for they were chiefly such waifs as chance had thrown in my way, stood in order about the room, seldom to be disturbed. The study had 3 windows, set with little old-fashioned panes of glass, each with a crack across it. The 2 on the western side looked, or rather peeped, between the willow branches down into the orchard, with glimpses of the river through the trees. The 3rd, facing northward, commanded a broader view of the river at a spot where its hitherto obscure waters gleam forth into the light of history. It was at this window that the clergyman who then dwelt in the manse stood watching the outbreak of a long and deadly struggle between 2 nations. He saw the irregular array of his parishioners on the farther side of the river, and the glittering line of the British on the hither bank. He awaited, in an agony of suspense, the rattle of the musketry. It came, and there needed but a gentle wind to sweep the battle smoke around this quiet house. Perhaps the reader, whom I cannot help considering as my guest in the Old Manse, and entitled to all courtesy in the way of sight showing, perhaps he will choose to take a nearer view of the memorable spot. We stand now on the river's brink. It may well be called the Concord, the river of peace and quietness, for it is certainly the most unexcitable and sluggish stream that ever loitered imperceptibly towards its eternity, the sea. Positively, I had lived 3 weeks beside it before it grew quite clear to my perception which way the current flowed. It never has a vivacious aspect except when a northwestern breeze is vexing its surface on a sunshiny day. From the incurable indolence of its nature, the stream is happily incapable of becoming the slave of human ingenuity, as is the fate of so many a wild, free mountain torrent. While all things else are compelled to subserve some useful purpose, it idles its sluggish life away in lazy liberty, without turning a solitary spindle or affording even water power enough to grind the corn that grows upon its banks. The torpor of its movement allows it nowhere a bright, pebbly shore, nor so much as a narrow strip of glistening sand in any part of its course. It slumbers between broad prairies, kissing the long meadow grass, and bathes the overhanging boughs of elder bushes and willows, or the roots of elms and ash trees and clumps of maples. Flags and rushes grow along its plashy shore. The yellow water lily spreads its broad, flat leaves on the margin, and the fragrant white pond lily abounds, generally selecting a position just so far from the river's brink that it cannot be grasped save at the hazard of plunging in. It is a marvel whence this perfect flower derives its loveliness and perfume, springing as it does from the black mud over which the river sleeps, and where lurk the slimy eel and speckled frog and the mud turtle, whom continual washing cannot cleanse. It is the very same black mud out of which the yellow lily sucks its obscene life and noisome odor. Thus we see, too, in the world that some persons assimilate only what is ugly and evil from the same moral circumstances which supply good and beautiful results, the fragrance of celestial flowers, to the daily life of others. The reader must not, from any testimony of mine, contract a dislike towards our slumbrous stream. In the light of a calm and golden sunset, it becomes lovely beyond expression, the more lovely for the quietude that so well accords with the hour when even the wind, after blustering all day long, usually hushes itself to rest. Each tree and rock and every blade of grass is distinctly imaged, and however unsightly in reality, assumes ideal beauty in the reflection. The minutest things of earth and the broad aspect of the firmament are pictured equally without effort and with the same felicity of success. All the sky glows downward at our feet. The rich clouds float through the unruffled bosom of the stream, like heavenly thoughts through a peaceful heart. We will not then malign our river as gross and impure, while it can glorify itself with so adequate a picture of the heaven that broods above it. Or, if we remember its tawny hue and the muddiness of its bed, let it be a symbol that the earthiest human soul has an infinite spiritual capacity and may contain the better world within its depths. But indeed, the same lesson might be drawn out of any mud puddle in the streets of a city, and being taught us everywhere, it must be true. Come, we have pursued a somewhat devious track in our walk to the battleground. Here we are at the point where the river was crossed by the old bridge, the possession of which was the immediate object of the contest. On the hither side grow 2 or 3 elms, throwing a wide circumference of shade, but which must have been planted at some period within the 80 years and 10 that have passed since the battle day. On the farther shore, overhung by a clump of elder bushes, we discern the stone abutment of the bridge. Looking down into the river, I once discovered some heavy fragments of the timbers, all green with half a century's growth of water moss, for during that length of time the tramp of horses and human footsteps have ceased along this ancient highway. The stream has here about the breadth of 20 strokes of a swimmer's arm, a space not too wide when the bullets were whistling across. Old people who dwell hereabouts will point out the very spots on the western bank where our countrymen fell down and died, and on this side of the river an obelisk of granite has grown up from the soil that was fertilized with British blood. The monument, not more than 20 feet in height, is such as it befitted the inhabitants of a village to erect in illustration of a matter of local interest rather than what was suitable to commemorate an epoch of national history. Still, by the fathers of the village this famous deed was done, and their descendants might rightfully claim the privilege of building a memorial. A humbler token of the fight, yet a more interesting one than the granite obelisk, may be seen close under the stone wall which separates the battleground from the precincts of the parsonage. It is the grave, marked by a small, moss-grown fragment of stone at the head and another at the foot. The grave of 2 British soldiers who were slain in the skirmish and have ever since slept peacefully where Zechariah Brown and Thomas Davis buried them. Soon was their warfare ended, a weary night march from Boston, a rattling volley of musketry across the river, and then these many years of rest. In the long procession of slain invaders who passed into eternity from the battlefields of the Revolution, these 2 nameless soldiers led the way. Lowell, the poet, as we were once standing over this grave, told me a tradition in reference to one of the inhabitants below. The story has something deeply impressive, though its circumstances cannot altogether be reconciled with probability. A youth in the service of the clergyman happened to be chopping wood that April morning at the back door of the manse, and when the noise of battle rang from side to side of the bridge, he hastened across the intervening field to see what might be going forward. It is rather strange, by the way, that this lad should have been so diligently at work when the whole population of town and country were startled out of their customary business by the advance of the British troops. Be that as it might, the tradition says that the lad now left his task and hurried to the battlefield with the axe still in his hand. The British had by this time retreated, the Americans were in pursuit, and the late scene of strife was thus deserted by both parties. 2 soldiers lay on the ground. One was a corpse, but as the young New Englander drew nigh, the other Briton raised himself painfully upon his hands and knees and gave a ghastly stare into his face. The boy, it must have been a nervous impulse, without purpose, without thought, and betokening a sensitive and impressible nature rather than a hardened one. The boy uplifted his axe and dealt the wounded soldier a fierce and fatal blow upon the head. I could wish that the grave might be opened, for I would fain know whether either of the skeleton soldiers has the mark of an axe in his skull. The story comes home to me like truth. Oftentimes, as an intellectual and moral exercise, I have sought to follow that poor youth through his subsequent career and observe how his soul was tortured by the bloodstone, contracted as it had been before the long custom of war had robbed human life of its sanctity, and while it still seemed murderous to slay a brother man. This one circumstance has borne more fruit for me than all that history tells us of the fight. Many strangers come in the summertime to view the battleground. For my own part, I have never found my imagination much excited by this or any other scene of historic celebrity. Nor would the placid margin of the river have lost any of its charm for me had men never fought and died there. There is a wilder interest in the tract of land perhaps 100 yards in breadth, which extends between the battlefield and the northern face of our Old Manse, with its contiguous avenue and orchard. Here, in some unknown age before the white man came, stood an Indian village, convenient to the river, whence its inhabitants must have drawn so large a part of their substance. The site is identified by the spear and arrowheads, the chisels and other implements of war, labor, and the chase, which the plow turns up from the soil. You see a splinter of stone half hidden beneath a sod. It looks like nothing worthy of note, but if you have faith enough to pick it up, behold a relic. Thoreau, who has a strange faculty of finding what the Indians have left behind them, first set me on the search, and I afterwards enriched myself with some very perfect specimens, so rudely wrought that it seemed almost as if chance had fashioned them. Their great charm consists in this rudeness and in the individuality of each article, so different from the productions of civilized machinery, which shapes everything on one pattern. There is exquisite delight, too, in picking up for oneself an arrowhead that was dropped centuries ago and has never been handled since, and which we thus receive directly from the hand of the red hunter who purposed to shoot it at his game or at an enemy. Such an incident builds up again the Indian village and its encircling forest, and recalls to life the painted chiefs and warriors, the squaws at their household toil, and the children sporting among the wigwams, while the little wind-rocked pappoose swings from the branch of a tree. It can hardly be told whether it is a joy or a pain, after such a momentary vision, to gaze around in the broad daylight of reality and see stone fences, white houses, potato fields, and men doggedly hoeing in their shirt sleeves and homespun pantaloons. But this is nonsense. The Old Manse is better than 1,000 wigwams. The Old Manse. We had almost forgotten it, but will return thither through the orchard. This was set out by the last clergyman in the decline of his life, when the neighbors laughed at the hoary-headed man for planting trees from which he could have no prospect of gathering fruit. Even had that been the case, there was only so much the better motive for planting them, in the pure and unselfish hope of benefiting his successors, an end so seldom achieved by more ambitious efforts. But the old minister, before reaching his patriarchal age of 90, ate the apples from this orchard during many years and added silver and gold to his annual stipend by disposing of the superfluity. It is pleasant to think of him walking among the trees in the quiet afternoons of early autumn and picking up here and there a windfall while he observes how heavily the branches are weighed down and computes the number of empty flour barrels that will be filled by their burden. He loved each tree, doubtless, as if it had been his own child. An orchard has a relation to mankind and readily connects itself with matters of the heart. The trees possess a domestic character. They have lost the wild nature of their forest kindred and have grown humanized by receiving the care of man, as well as by contributing to his wants. There is so much individuality of character, too, among apple trees that it gives them all additional claim to be the objects of human interest. One is harsh and crabbed in its manifestations. Another gives us fruit as mild as charity. One is churlish and illiberal, evidently grudging the few apples that it bears. Another exhausts itself in free-hearted benevolence. The variety of grotesque shapes into which apple trees contort themselves has its effect on those who get acquainted with them. They stretch out their crooked branches and take such hold of the imagination that we remember them as humorists and odd fellows. And what is more melancholy than the old apple trees that linger about the spot where once stood a homestead, but where there is now only a ruined chimney, rising out of a grassy and weed-grown cellar? They offer their fruit to every wayfarer, apples that are bitter-sweet, with the moral of time's vicissitude. I have met with no other such pleasant trouble in the world as that of finding myself, with only the 2 or 3 mouths which it was my privilege to feed, the sole inheritor of the old clergyman's wealth of fruits. Throughout the summer there were cherries and currants, and then came autumn with his immense burden of apples, dropping them continually from his overladen shoulders as he trudged along. In the stillest afternoon, if I listened, the thump of a great apple was audible, falling without a breath of wind from the mere necessity of perfect ripeness. And besides, there were pear trees that flung down bushels upon bushels of heavy pears, and peach trees, which in a good year tormented me with peaches, neither to be eaten nor kept, nor without labor and perplexity to be given away. The idea of an infinite generosity and exhaustless bounty on the part of our Mother Nature was well worth obtaining through such cares as these. That feeling can be enjoyed in perfection only by the natives of summer islands, where the breadfruit, the cocoa, the palm, and the orange grow spontaneously and hold forth the ever-ready meal. But likewise, almost as well by a man long habituated to city life, who plunges into such a solitude as that of the Old Manse, where he plucks the fruit of trees that he did not plant, and which therefore, to my heterodox taste, bear the closest resemblance to those that grew in Eden. It has been an apothegm these 5,000 years that toil sweetens the bread it earns. For my part, speaking from hard experience acquired while belaboring the rugged furrows of Brook Farm, I relish best the free gifts of Providence. Not that it can be disputed that the light toil requisite to cultivate a moderately sized garden imparts such zest to kitchen vegetables as is never found in those of the market gardener. Childless men, if they would know something of the bliss of paternity, should plant a seed, be it squash, bean, Indian corn, or perhaps a mere flower or worthless weed, should plant it with their own hands and nurse it from infancy to maturity altogether by their own care. If there be not too many of them, each individual plant becomes an object of separate interest. My garden that skirted the avenue of the manse was of precisely the right extent. An hour or two of morning labor was all that it required, but I used to visit and revisit it a dozen times a day, and stand in deep contemplation over my vegetable progeny with a love that nobody could share or conceive of who had never taken part in the process of creation. It was one of the most bewitching sights in the world to observe a hill of beans thrusting aside the soil, or a row of early peas just peeping forth sufficiently to trace a line of delicate green. Later in the season, the hummingbirds were attracted by the blossoms of a peculiar variety of bean, and they were a joy to me, those little spiritual visitants, for deigning to sip airy food out of my nectar cups. Multitudes of bees used to bury themselves in the yellow blossoms of the summer squashes. This too was a deep satisfaction, although when they had laden themselves with sweets, they flew away to some unknown hive, which would give back nothing in requital of what my garden had contributed. But I was glad thus to fling a benefaction upon the passing breeze, with the certainty that somebody must profit by it, and that there would be a little more honey in the world to allay the sourness and bitterness which mankind is always complaining of. Yes, indeed, my life was the sweeter for that honey. Speaking of summer squashes, I must say a word of their beautiful and varied forms. They presented an endless diversity of urns and vases, shallow or deep, scalloped or plain, molded in patterns which a sculptor would do well to copy, since art has never invented anything more graceful. 100 squashes in the garden were worth, in my eyes at least, of being rendered indestructible in marble. If ever Providence, but I know it never will, should assign me a superfluity of gold, part of it shall be expended for a service of plate or most delicate porcelain, to be wrought into the shapes of summer squashes gathered from vines which I will plant with my own hands. As dishes for containing vegetables, they would be peculiarly appropriate. But not merely the squeamish love of the beautiful was gratified by my toil in the kitchen garden. There was a hearty enjoyment likewise in observing the growth of the crook-necked winter squashes from the first little bulb, with the withered blossom adhering to it until they lay strewn upon the soil, big, round fellows, hiding their heads beneath the leaves, but turning up their great yellow rotundities to the noontide sun. Gazing at them, I felt that by my agency, something worth living for had been done. A new substance was born into the world. They were real and tangible existences, which the mind could seize hold of and rejoice in. A cabbage, too, especially the early Dutch cabbage, which swells to a monstrous circumference, until its ambitious heart often bursts asunder, is a matter to be proud of when we can claim a share with the earth and sky in producing it. But after all, the hugest pleasure is reserved until these vegetable children of ours are smoking on the table, and we, like Saturn, make a meal of them. What with the river, the battlefield, the orchard, and the garden, the reader begins to despair of finding his way back into the Old Manse. But in agreeable weather, it is the truest hospitality to keep him out of doors. I never grew quite acquainted with my habitation till a long spell of sulky rain had confined me beneath its roof. There could not be a more somber aspect of external nature than as then seen from the windows of my study. The great willow tree had caught and retained among its leaves a whole cataract of water, to be shaken down at intervals by the frequent gusts of wind. All day long and for a week together the rain was drip, drip, dripping and splash, splash, splashing from the eaves and bubbling and foaming into the tubs beneath the spouts. The old unpainted shingles of the house and outbuildings were black with moisture, and the mosses of ancient growth upon the walls looked green and fresh, as if they were the newest things, an afterthought of time. The usually mirrored surface of the river was blurred by an infinity of raindrops. The whole landscape had a completely water-soaked appearance, conveying the impression that the earth was wet through like a sponge, while the summit of a wooded hill, about a mile distant, was enveloped in a dense mist, where the demon of the tempest seemed to have his abiding place and to be plotting still direr inclemencies. Nature has no kindness, no hospitality during a rain. In the fiercest beat of sunny days, she retains a secret mercy and welcomes the wayfarer to shady nooks of the woods whither the sun cannot penetrate. But she provides no shelter against her storms. It makes us shiver to think of those deep, umbrageous recesses, those overshadowing banks where we found such enjoyment during the sultry afternoons. Not a twig of foliage there but would dash a little shower into our faces. Looking reproachfully towards the impenetrable sky, if sky there be above that dismal uniformity of cloud, we are apt to murmur against the whole system of the universe, since it involves the extinction of so many summer days in so short a life by the hissing and spluttering rain. In such spells of weather, and it is to be supposed such weather came, Eve's bower in paradise must have been but a cheerless and a aguish kind of shelter, nowise comparable to the old parsonage, which had resources of its own to beguile the week's imprisonment. The idea of sleeping on a couch of wet roses. Happy the man who in a rainy day can betake himself to a huge garret stored like that of the manse, with lumber that each generation has left behind it from a period before the Revolution. Our garret was an arched hall, dimly illuminated through small and dusty windows. It was but a twilight at the best, and there were nooks, or rather caverns of deep obscurity, the secrets of which I never learned, being too reverent of their dust and cobwebs. The beams and rafters, roughly hewn and with strips of bark still on them, and the rude masonry of the chimneys made the garret look wild and uncivilized, an aspect unlike what was seen elsewhere in the quiet and decorous old house. but on one side there was a little whitewashed apartment which bore the traditionary title of the Saint's Chamber, because holy men in their youth had slept and studied and prayed there. With its elevated retirement, its one window, its small fireplace, and its closet convenient for an oratory, it was the very spot where a young man might inspire himself with solemn enthusiasm and cherish saintly dreams. The occupants at various epochs had left brief records and ejaculations inscribed upon the walls. There, too, hung a tattered and shriveled roll of canvas, which on inspection proved to be the forcibly wrought picture of a clergyman in wig, band, and gown, holding a Bible in his hand. As I turned his face towards the light, he eyed me with an air of authority, such as men of his profession seldom assume in our days. The original had been pastor of the parish more than a century ago, a friend of Whitefield, and almost his equal in fervid eloquence. I bowed before the effigy of the dignified divine, and felt as if I had now met face to face with the ghost, by whom, as there was reason to apprehend, the manse was haunted. Houses of any antiquity in New England are so invariably possessed with spirits that the matter seems hardly worth alluding to. Our ghost used to heave deep sighs in a particular corner of the parlor, and sometimes rustled paper as if he were turning over a sermon in the long upper entry, where nevertheless he was invisible in spite of the bright moonshine that fell through the eastern window. Not improbably he wished me to edit and publish a selection from a chest full of manuscript discourses that stood in the garret. Once, while Hillard and other friends sat talking with us in the twilight, there came a rustling noise as of a minister's silk gown sweeping through the very midst of the company, so closely as almost to brush against the chairs. Still, there was nothing visible. A yet stranger business was that of a ghostly servant maid who used to be heard in the kitchen at deepest midnight, grinding coffee, cooking, ironing, performing, in short, all kinds of domestic labor, although no traces of anything accomplished could be detected the next morning. Some neglected duty of her servitude, some ill-starched ministerial band, disturbed the poor damsel in her grave and kept her at work without any wages. But to return from this digression, a part of my predecessor's library was stored in the garret, no unfit receptacle indeed for such dreary trash as comprised the greater number of volumes. The old books would have been worth nothing at an auction. In this venerable garret, however, they possessed an interest quite apart from their literary value as heirlooms, many of which had been transmitted down through a series of consecrated hands from the days of the mighty Puritan divines. Autographs of famous names were to be seen in faded ink on some of their fly-leaves, and there were marginal observations or interpolated pages closely covered with manuscript in illegible shorthand, perhaps concealing matter of profound truth and wisdom. The world will never be the better for it. A few of the books were Latin folios, written by Catholic authors, others demolished papistry as with a sledgehammer in plain English. A dissertation on the book of Job, which only Job himself could have had patience to read, filled at least a score of small, thick-set quartos at the rate of 2 or 3 volumes to a chapter. Then there was a vast folio body of divinity, too corpulent a body, it might be feared, to comprehend the spiritual element of religion. Volumes of this form dated back 200 years or more, and were generally bound in black leather, exhibiting precisely such an appearance as we should attribute to books of enchantment. Others, equally antique, were of a size proper to be carried in the large waistcoat pockets of old times, diminutive but as black as their bulkier brethren, and abundantly interfused with Greek and Latin quotations. These little old volumes impressed me as if they had been intended for very large ones, but had been unfortunately blighted at an early stage of their growth. The rain pattered upon the roof, and the sky gloomed through the dusty garret windows, while I burrowed among these venerable books in search of any living thought which should burn like a coal of fire or glow like an inextinguishable gem beneath the dead trumpery that had long hidden it. But I found no such treasure. All was dead alike, and I could not but muse deeply and wonderingly upon the humiliating fact that the works of man's intellect decay like those of his hands. Thought grows moldy. What was good and nourishing food for the spirits of one generation affords no sustenance for the next. Books of religion, however, cannot be considered a fair test of the enduring and vivacious properties of human thought, because such books so seldom really touch upon their ostensible subject, and have therefore so little business to be written at all. So long as an unlettered soul contained saving grace, there would seem to be no deadly error in holding theological libraries to be accumulations of, for the most part, stupendous impertinence. Many of the books had accrued in the latter years of the last clergyman's lifetime. These threatened to be of even less interest than the elder works a century hence to any curious inquirer who should then rummage then as I was doing now. Volumes of the Liberal Preacher and Christian Examiner, occasional sermons, controversial pamphlets, tracts, and other productions of a like fugitive nature took the place of the thick and heavy volumes of past time. In a physical point of view, there was much the same difference as between a feather and a lump of lead, but intellectually regarded, the specific gravity of old and new was about upon a par. Both also were alike frigid. The elder books nevertheless seemed to have been earnestly written, and might be conceived to have possessed warmth at some former period, although with the lapse of time, the heated masses had cooled down even to the freezing point. The frigidity of the modern productions, on the other hand, was characteristic and inherent, and evidently had little to do with the writer's qualities of mind and heart. In fine, of this whole dusty heap of literature, I tossed aside all the sacred part, and felt myself nonetheless a Christian for eschewing it. There appeared no hope of either mounting to the better world on a Gothic staircase of ancient folios, or of flying thither on the wings of a modern tract. Nothing, strange to say, retained any sap, except what had been written for the passing day and year, without the remotest pretension or idea of permanence. There were a few old newspapers and still older almanacs, which reproduced to my mental eye the epochs when they had issued from the press, with a distinctness that was altogether unaccountable. It was as if I had found bits of magic looking-glass among the books, with the images of a vanished century in them. I turned my eyes towards the tattered picture above mentioned, and asked of the austere divine wherefore it was that he and his brethren, after the most painful rummaging and groping into their minds, had been able to produce nothing half so real as these newspaper scribblers and almanac makers had thrown off in the effervescence of a moment. The portrait responded not. So I sought an answer for myself. It is the age itself that writes newspapers and almanacs, which therefore have a distinct purpose and meaning at the time, and a kind of intelligible truth for all times, whereas most other works, being written by men who, in the very act, set themselves apart from their age, are likely to possess little significance when new, and none at all when old. Genius indeed melts many ages into one, and thus affects something permanent, yet still with a similarity of office to that of the more ephemeral writer. A work of genius is but the newspaper of a century, or perchance of 100 centuries. Lightly as I have spoken of these old books, there yet lingers with me a superstitious reverence for literature of all kinds. A bound volume has a charm in my eyes similar to what scraps of manuscript possess for the good Mussulman. He imagines that those wind-wafted records are perhaps hallowed by some sacred verse, and I, that every new book or antique one may contain the open sesame, the spell to disclose treasures hidden in some unsuspected cave of truth. Thus it was not without sadness that I turned away from the library of the Old Manse. Blessed was the sunshine when it came again at the close of another stormy day, beaming from the edge of the western horizon, while the massive firmament of clouds threw down all the gloom it could, but served only to kindle the golden light into a more brilliant glow by the strongly contrasted shadows. Heaven smiled at the earth, so long unseen from beneath its heavy eyelid. Tomorrow for the hilltops and the wood paths, or it might be that Ellery Charming came up the avenue to join me in a fishing excursion on the river. Strange and happy times were those when we cast aside all irksome forms and straight-laced habitudes and delivered ourselves up to the free air, to live like the Indians or any less conventional race during one bright semicircle of the sun. Rowing our boat against the current between wide meadows, we turned aside into the Assabeth. A more lovely stream than this, for a mile above its junction with the Concord, has never flowed on earth, nowhere indeed except to lave the interior regions of a poet's imagination. It is sheltered from the breeze by woods and a hillside, so that elsewhere there might be a hurricane, and here scarcely a ripple across the shaded water. The current lingers along so gently that the mere force of the boatman's will seems sufficient to propel his craft against it. It comes flowing softly through the midmost privacy and deepest heart of a wood, which whispers it to be quiet, while the stream whispers back again from its sedgy borders, as if river and wood were hushing one another to sleep. Yes, the river sleeps along its course and dreams of the sky and of the clustering foliage, amid which fall showers of broken sunlight, imparting specks of vivid cheerfulness in contrast with the quiet depth of the prevailing tint. Of all this scene, the slumbering river has a dream picture in its bosom. Which, after all, was the most real, the picture or the original, the objects palpable to our grosser senses, or their apotheosis in the stream beneath? Surely the disembodied images stand in closer relation to the soul. But both the original and the reflection had here an ideal charm, and had it been a thought more wild, I could have fancied that this river had strayed forth out of the rich scenery of my companion's inner world, only the vegetation along its banks should then have had an oriental character. Gentle and unobtrusive as the river is, yet the tranquil woods seem hardly satisfied to allow it passage. The trees are rooted on the very verge of the water and dip their pendant branches into it. At one spot there is a lofty bank on the slope of which grow some hemlocks, declining across the stream with outstretched arms, as if resolute to take the plunge. In other places the banks are almost on a level with the water, so that the quiet congregation of trees set their feet in the flood and are fringed with foliage down to the surface. Cardinal flowers kindle their spiral flames and illuminate the dark nooks among the shrubbery. The pond lily grows abundantly along the margin, that delicious flower which, as Thoreau tells me, opens its virgin bosom to the first sunlight and perfects its being through the magic of that genial kiss. He has beheld beds of them unfolding in due succession as the sunrise stole gradually from flower to flower, a sight not to be hoped for unless when a poet adjusts his inward eye to a proper focus with the outward organ. Grapevines here and there twine themselves around shrub and tree and hang their clusters over the water within reach of the boatman's hand. Oftentimes they unite two trees of alien race in an inextricable twine, marrying the hemlock and the maple against their will, and enriching them with a purple offspring of which neither is the parent. One of these ambitious parasites has climbed into the upper branches of a tall white pine and is still ascending from bough to bough, unsatisfied till it shall crown the tree's airy summit with a wreath of its broad foliage and a cluster of its grapes. The winding course of the stream continually shut out the scene behind us and revealed as calm and lovely a one before. We glided from depth to depth and breathed new seclusion at every turn. The shy kingfisher flew from the withered branch close at hand to another at a distance, uttering a shrill cry of anger or alarm. Ducks that had been floating there since the preceding eve were startled at our approach and skimmed along the glassy river, breaking its dark surface with a bright streak. The pickerel leaped from among the lily pads, the turtle, sunning itself upon a rock or at the root of a tree, slid suddenly into the water with a plunge. The painted Indian who paddled his canoe along the Assabeth 300 years ago could hardly have seen a wilder gentleness displayed upon its banks and reflected in its bosom than we did. Nor could the same Indian have prepared his noontide meal with more simplicity. We drew up our skiff at some point where the overarching shade formed a natural bower, and there kindled a fire with the pine cones and decayed branches that lay strewn plentifully around. Soon the smoke ascended among the trees, impregnated with a savory incense, not heavy, dull, and surfeiting, like the steam of cookery within doors, but sprightly and piquant. The smell of our feast was akin to the woodland odors with which it mingled. There was no sacrilege committed by our intrusion there. The sacred solitude was hospitable and granted us free leave to cook and eat in the recess that was at once our kitchen and banqueting hall. It is strange what humble offices may be performed in a beautiful scene without destroying its poetry. Our fire red gleaming among the trees, and we beside it, busied with culinary rites and spreading out our meal on a moss-grown log, all seemed in unison with the river gliding by and the foliage rustling over us. And, what was strangest, neither did our mirth seem to disturb the propriety of the solemn woods, although the hobgoblins of the old wilderness and the will-o'-the-wisps that glimmered in the marshy places might have come trooping to share our table talk and have added their shrill laughter to our merriment. It was the very spot in which to utter the extremest nonsense or the profoundest wisdom, or that ethereal product of the mind which partakes of both and may become one or the other in correspondence with the faith and insight of the auditor. So, amid sunshine and shadow, rustling leaves and sighing waters, up gushed our talk like the babble of a fountain. The evanescent spray was Ellery's, and his too, the lumps of golden thought that lay glimmering in the fountain's bed, and brightened both our faces by the reflection. Could he have drawn out that virgin gold and stamped it with the mint mark that alone gives currency, the world might have had the profit and he the fame. My mind was the richer merely by the knowledge that it was there, but the chief profit of those wild days to him and me lay not in any definite idea, not in any angular or rounded truth, which we dug out of the shapeless mass of problematical stuff, but in the freedom which we thereby won from all custom and conventionalism and fettering influences of man on man. We were so free today that it was impossible to be slaves again tomorrow. When we crossed the threshold of the house or trod the thronged pavements of a city, Still the leaves of the trees that overhang the Asabeth were whispering to us, "Be free, be free." Therefore, along that shady riverbank there are spots marked with a heap of ashes and half-consumed brands, only less sacred in my remembrance than the hearth of a household fire. And yet, how sweet as we floated homeward down the golden river at sunset. How sweet was it to return within the system of human society, not as to a dungeon and a chain, but as to a stately edifice, whence we could go forth at will into state. Her simplicity, how gently too did the sight of the Old Manse, best seen from the river, overshadowed with its willow, and all environed about with the foliage of its orchard and avenue, how gently did its gray, homely aspect rebuke the speculative extravagances of the day. It had grown sacred in connection with the artificial life against which we invade. It had been a home for many years, in spite of all. It was my home too. And with these thoughts, it seemed to me that all the artifice and conventionalism of life was but an impalpable thinness upon its surface, and that the depth below was none the worse for it. Once, as we turned our boat to the bank, there was a cloud in the shape of an immensely gigantic figure of a hound, couched above the house, as if keeping guard over it. Gazing at this symbol, I prayed that the upper influences might long protect the institutions that had grown out of the heart of mankind. If ever my readers should decide to give up civilized life, cities, houses, and whatever moral or material enormities in addition to these the perverted ingenuity of our race has contrived, let it be in the early autumn. Then nature will love him better than at any other season, and will take him to her bosom with a more motherly tenderness. I could scarcely endure the roof of the old house above me in those first autumnal days. How early in the summer, too, the prophecy of autumn comes. Earlier in some years than in others, sometimes even in the first weeks of July. There is no other feeling like what is caused by this faint, doubtful, yet real perception, if it be not rather a foreboding of the year's decay, so blessedly sweet and sad in the same breath. Did I say that there was no feeling like it? Ah, but there is a half-acknowledged melancholy like to this when we stand in the perfected vigor of our life and feel that time has now given us all his flowers, and that the next work of his never idle fingers must be to steal them one by one away. I have forgotten whether the song of the cricket be not as early a token of autumn's approach as any other, that song which may be called an audible stillness, for though very loud and heard afar, yet the mind does not take note of it as a sound, so completely is its individual existence merged among the accompanying characteristics of the season. Alas for the pleasant summer time. In August, the grass is still verdant on the hills and in the valleys. The foliage of the trees is as dense as ever and as green. The flowers gleam forth in richer abundance along the margin of the river and by the stone walls and deep among the woods. The days, too, are as fervid now as they were a month ago. And yet, in every breath of wind and in every beam of sunshine, we hear the whispered farewell and behold the parting smile of a dear friend. There is a coolness amid all the heat, a mildness in the blazing noon. Not a breeze can stir, but it thrills us with the breath of autumn. A pensive glory is seen in the far golden gleams among the shadows of the trees. The flowers, even the brightest of them, and they are the most gorgeous of the year, have this gentle sadness wedded to their pomp and typify the character of the delicious time each within itself. The brilliant cardinal flower has never seemed gay to me, Still later in the season, nature's tenderness waxes stronger. It is impossible not to be fond of our mother now, for she is so fond of us. At other periods, she does not make this impression on me, or only at rare intervals, but in those genial days of autumn, when she has perfected her harvests and accomplished every needful thing that was given her to do, then she overflows with a blessed superfluity of love. She has leisure to caress her children now. It is good to be alive, and at such times. Thank heaven for breath, yes, for mere breath, when it is made up of a heavenly breeze like this. It comes with a real kiss upon our cheeks. It would linger fondly around us if it might. But since it must be gone, it embraces us with its whole kindly heart, and passes onward to embrace likewise the next thing that it meets. A blessing is flung abroad and scattered far and wide over the earth, to be gathered up by all who choose. I recline upon the still unwithered grass and whisper to myself, O perfect day, O beautiful world, O beneficent God. And it is the promise of a blessed eternity, for our Creator would never have made such lovely days and have given us the deep hearts to enjoy them, above and beyond all thought, unless we were meant to be immortal. This sunshine is the golden pledge thereof. It beams through the gates of paradise and shows us glimpses far inward. By and by, in a little time, the outward world puts on a drear austerity. On some October morning there is a heavy hoarfrost on the grass and along the tops of the fences, and at sunrise the leaves fall from the trees of our avenue without a breath of wind, quietly descending by their own weight. All summer long they have murmured like the noise of waters. They have roared loudly while the branches were wrestling with the thunder gust. They have made music both glad and solemn. They have attuned my thoughts by their quiet sound as I paced to and fro beneath the arch of intermingling boughs. Now they can only rustle under my feet. Henceforth, the gray parsonage begins to assume a larger importance, and draws to its fireside, for the abomination of the airtight stove is reserved till wintry weather, draws closer and closer to its fireside, the vagrant impulses that had gone wandering about through the summer. When summer was dead and buried, the Old Manse became as lonely as a hermitage. Not that ever, in my time at least, it had been thronged with company, but at no rare intervals we welcomed some friend out of the dusty glare and tumult of the world, and rejoiced to share with him the transparent obscurity that was floating over us. In one respect, our precincts were like the enchanted ground through which the pilgrim traveled on his way to the celestial city. The guests, each and all, felt a slumberous influence upon them. They fell asleep in chairs, or took a more deliberate siesta on the sofa, or were seen stretched among the shadows of the orchard, looking up dreamily through the boughs. They could not have paid a more acceptable compliment to my abode, nor to my own qualities as a host. I held it as a proof that they left their cares behind them, as they passed between the stone gateposts at the entrance of our avenue, and that the so powerful opiate was the abundance of peace and quiet within and all around us. Others could give them pleasure and amusement or instruction. These could be picked up anywhere, but it was for me to give them rest in a life of trouble. What better could be done for those weary and world-worn spirits? For him whose career of perpetual action was impeded and harassed by the rarest of his powers and the richest of his acquirements. For another who had thrown his ardent heart from earliest youth into the strife of politics, and now, perchance, began to suspect that one lifetime is too brief for the accomplishment of any lofty aim. for her oil whose feminine nature had been imposed the heavy gift of intellectual power, such as a strong man might have staggered under, and with it the necessity to act upon the world. In a word, not to multiply instances, what better could be done for anybody who came within our magic circle than to throw the spell of a tranquil spirit over him? And when it had wrought its full effect, then we dismissed him, with but misty reminiscences, as if he had been dreaming of us. Were I to adopt a pet idea, as so many people do, and fondle it in my embraces to the exclusion of all others, it would be that the great want which mankind labors under at this present period is sleep. The world should recline its vast head on the first convenient pillow and take an age-long nap. It has gone distracted through a morbid activity, and, while preternaturally wide awake, is nevertheless tormented by visions that seem real to it now, but would assume their true aspect and character were all things once set right by an interval of sound repose. This is the only method of getting rid of old delusions and avoiding new ones, of regenerating our race so that it might in due time awake as an infant out of dewy slumber, of restoring to us the simple perception of what is right and the single-hearted desire to achieve it, both of which have long been lost in consequence of this weary activity of brain and torpor or passion of the heart that now afflict the universe. Stimulants, the only mode of treatment hitherto attempted, cannot quell the disease. They do but heighten the delirium. Let not the above paragraph ever be quoted against the author, for, though tinctured with its modicum of truth, it is the result and expression of what he knew, while he was writing, to be but a distorted survey of the state and prospects of mankind. There were circumstances around me which made it difficult to view the world precisely as it exists, for, severe and sober as was the Old Manse, it was necessary to go but a little way beyond its threshold, before meeting with stranger moral shapes of men than might have been encountered elsewhere in a circuit of 1,000 miles. These hobgoblins of flesh and blood were attracted thither by the wide-spreading influence of a great original thinker who had his earthly abode at the opposite extremity of our village. His mind acted upon other minds of a certain constitution with wonderful magnetism, and drew many men upon long pilgrimages to speak with him face to face. Young visionaries, to whom just so much of insight had been imparted as to make life all a labyrinth around them, came to seek the clue that should guide them out of their self-involved bewilderment. Gray-headed theorists, whose systems at first air had finally imprisoned them in an iron framework, traveled painfully to his door, not to ask deliverance, but to invite the free spirit into their own thraldom. People that had lighted on a new thought, or a thought that they fancied new, came to Emerson as the finder of a glittering gem hastens to a lapidary, to ascertain its quality and value. Uncertain, troubled, earnest wanderers through the midnight of the moral world beheld his intellectual fire as a beacon burning on a hilltop, and climbing the difficult ascent, looked forth into the surrounding obscurity more hopefully than hitherto. The light revealed objects unseen before, mountains, gleaming lakes, glimpses of a creation among the chaos. But also, as was unavoidable, it attracted bats and owls and the whole host of night birds, which flapped their dusky wings against the gazer's eyes, and sometimes were mistaken for fowls of angelic feather. Such delusions always hover nigh whenever a beacon fire of truth is kindled. For myself, there bad been epochs of my life when I, too, might have asked of this prophet the master word that should solve me the riddle of the universe. But now, being happy, I felt as if there were no question to be put, and therefore admired Emerson as a poet of deep beauty and austere tenderness, but sought nothing from him as a philosopher. It was good, nevertheless, to meet him in the wood paths, or sometimes in our avenue, with that pure intellectual gleam diffused about his presence like the garment of a shining one, and be so quiet, so simple, so without pretension, encountering each man alive as if expecting to receive more than he could impart. And, in truth, the heart of many an ordinary man had, perchance, inscriptions which he could not read, but it was impossible to dwell in his vicinity without inhaling more or less the mountain atmosphere of his lofty thought, which, in the brains of some people, wrought a singular giddiness, new truth being as heady as new wine. Never was a poor little country village infested with such a variety of queer, strangely dressed, oddly behaved mortals, most of whom took upon themselves to be important agents of the world's destiny, yet were simply bores of a very intense water. Such, I imagine, is the invariable character of persons who crowd so closely about an original thinker as to draw in his unuttered breath and thus become imbued with a false originality. This triteness of novelty is enough to make any man of common sense blaspheme at all ideas of less than a century's standing, and pray that the world may be petrified and rendered immovable in precisely the worst moral and physical state that it ever yet arrived at, rather than be benefited by such schemes of such philosophers. And now I begin to feel, and perhaps should have sooner felt, that we have talked enough of the Old Manse. Mine honored reader, it may be, will vilify the poor author as an egotist for babbling through so many pages about a moss-grown country parsonage and his life within its walls, and on the river, and in the woods, and the influences that wrought upon him from all these sources. My conscience, however, does not reproach me with betraying anything too sacredly individual to be revealed by a human spirit to its brother or sister spirit. How narrow, how shallow and scanty, too, is the stream of thought that has been flowing from my pen, compared with the broad tide of dim emotions, ideas, and associations which swell around me from that portion of my existence. How little have I told, and of that little, how almost nothing is even tinctured with any quality that makes it exclusively my own. Has the reader gone wandering hand in hand with me through the inner passages of my being? And have we groped together into all its chambers and examined their treasures or their rubbish? Not so. We have been standing on the greensward, but just within the cavern's mouth, where the common sunshine is free to penetrate, and where every footstep is therefore free to come. I have appealed to no sentiment or sensibilities save such as are diffused among us all. So far as I am a man of really individual attributes, I veil my face, nor am I, nor have I ever been, one of those supremely hospitable people who serve up their own hearts, delicately fried with brain sauce, as a tidbit for their beloved public. Glancing back over what I have written, it seems but the scattered reminiscences of a single summer. In fairyland there is no measurement of time, and in a spot so sheltered from the turmoil of life's ocean, 3 years hastened away with a noiseless flight as the breezy sunshine chases the cloud shadows across the depths of a still valley. Now came hints, growing more and more distinct, that the owner of the old house was pining for his native air. Carpenters next appeared, making a tremendous racket among the outbuildings, strewing the green grass with pine shavings and chips of chestnut joists, and vexing the whole antiquity of the place with their discordant renovations. Soon, moreover, they divested our abode of the veil of woodbine which had crept over a large portion of its southern face. All the aged mosses were cleared unsparingly away, and there were horrible whispers about brushing up the external walls with a coat of paint. A purpose as little to my taste as might be that of rouging the venerable cheeks of one's grandmother. But the hand that renovates is always more sacrilegious than that which destroys. In fine, we gathered up our household goods, drank a farewell cup of tea in our pleasant little breakfast room. Delicately fragrant tea, an unpurchasable luxury, one of the many angel gifts that had fallen like dew upon us, and passed forth between the tall stone gate-posts as uncertain as the wandering Arabs where our tent might next be pitched. Providence took me by the hand, and an oddity of dispensation which I trust there is no irreverence in smiling at, has led me, as the newspapers announce while I am writing, from the Old Manse into a custom house. As a storyteller, I have often contrived strange vicissitudes for my imaginary personages, but none like this. The treasure of intellectual gold, which I hoped to find in our secluded dwelling, had never come to light. No profound treatise of ethics, no philosophic history, no novel even, that could stand unsupported on its edges. All that I had to show, as a man of letters, were these few tales and essays which had blossomed out like flowers in the calm summer of my heart and mind. Save editing, an easy task, the journal of my friend of many years, the African cruiser, I had done nothing else. With these idle weeds and withering blossoms, I have intermixed some that were produced long ago, old faded things, reminding me of flowers pressed between the leaves of a book, and now offer the bouquet, such as it is, to any whom it may please. These fitful sketches, with so little of external life about them, yet claiming no profundity of purpose, so reserved even while they sometimes seem so frank, often but half in earnest, and never, even when most so, expressing satisfactorily the thoughts which they profess to image. Such trifles, I truly feel, afford no solid basis for a literary reputation. Nevertheless, the public, if my limited number of readers, whom I venture to regard rather as a circle of friends, may be termed a public, will receive them the more kindly as the last offering, the last collection of this nature which it is my purpose ever to put forth. Unless I could do better, I have done enough in this kind. For myself, the book will always retain one charm, as reminding me of the river with its delightful solitudes, and of the avenue, the garden, and the orchard, and especially the dear Old Manse, with the little study on its western side, and the sunshine glimmering through the willow branches while I wrote. Let the reader, if he will do me so much honor, imagine himself my guest, and that, having seen whatever may be worthy of notice within and about the Old Manse, he has finally been ushered into my study. There, after seating him in an antique elbow chair, an heirloom of the house, I take forth a roll of manuscript and entreat his attention to the following tales. An act of personal inhospitality, however, which I never was guilty of, nor ever will be, even to my worst enemy.